Right after high school, I moved out to the Midwest. I have nothing for me here on the West Coast and needed to get away from the drama that my life was tied up in. My parents offered me no support. My friends were deadbeats, and the girl I had loved had lost interest in me. Instead of being a bitch and being a fucking bum and working a Pizza Hut till I was 30, I moved away from the town I lived in and settled down 1,000 miles east where I was born and raised. There, I met Nick. He was tall, thin, and had eyes that were completely black. He worked at a morgue or a funeral home or something. He handled dead bodies, picked them up, dropped them off, dressed them up, and cremated them. When Nick and I hung out and did stuff together, things would always happen. Things that couldn't be explained by me or any logic I possessed at the time. I knew very little of Nick. Never met any family, didn't learn anything of his past. He lived alone, and as far as I know, never hung out with anyone but me. He was dark-haired and had black eyes. He was taller than me. I'm about 6 foot even, and he was very thin. He drove an old car like a Crown Victoria or something similar. Old, classic ride. We met at a Blockbuster. I asked him about a movie. He said it was bad and suggested a different movie. I thanked him and went on my way. Every time I entered that Blockbuster, he was in there. Every time. Never failed. Whether it was 8 a.m. or 11 p.m., he was there. Never said hi, never acknowledged him. I asked the employees if he worked there or anything. They said no. It was just a customer who watched a lot of movies. I shrugged it off and just started paying attention to his choices, typically foreign horror films, documentaries as well. Management guessed he had seen every movie in the store twice. I approached him again and asked him for a movie choice. He suggested a movie called The Martyrs, saying it was a decent watch but a silly ending. I kept pressing him for movies before finally asking him if he wanted to hang out. I was new in town and apparently all he did was watch movies. He agreed and met me a couple of times for dinner. We traded numbers, but he didn't have texting. He had a very old phone, like early model Nokia. We went to a place for some burgers and shared dinner. I told him about where I was from, where I stayed, and what I did for work. It was a little awkward at first. All he did was nod and make small comments. When asked where he was from, he shrugged and said, "Depends," or "I don't remember." I took it as it's personal, so I dropped it. After dinner one night, that's really all we did at first. He said he wanted to drive around. I agreed, deciding I had nothing better to do, and exploring the new city sounded fun. We hopped in his ride, rolled down the windows, and cruised around for a bit. He didn't say anything and just listened to an old cassette he had playing in the car. It was boring, but it was something. We continued to cruise around for most of the night. We passed off one of the main roads and wended through an older neighborhood. We slowly passed out of the city and into a smaller town, out of the brick and mortar, and into the forest. The smell of the air changed from pollution to death. Literally. The forest smelled like it was piles of rotting animals or something. I asked to roll up my window, but he ignored me. We followed the same road for miles until there were no houses. The smell got worse and worse, to a point where I had to pull my shirt over my nose. The street turned into a dirt road, and we passed over a set of railroad tracks. The streetlights disappeared, and we were swallowed up by the dark forest. Ahead of us was a single light. It illuminated a part of a tall wooden fence. Nick brought the car to a stop and shifted it into park. He didn't turn and looked at me, just looked forward, watching the hazy light flicker against the fence. 10 or 20 minutes passed before I said anything. A figure passed underneath the street lamp. A short, thin, bipedal creature. It stepped out quickly from the darkness and stood directly beneath the light. I inhaled quickly and turned to Nick. He watched it without any concern. He turned the lights of his vehicle off, apparently not wanting to disturb it. "I come here and watch them from time to time," he explained. I asked what it was. He shrugged. The creature didn't remain in the light for long. It dropped to all fours and quickly scurried out of sight. I shook my head, confused. Was it a person? A bear maybe, standing on its hind legs? I asked Nick, but he had no answer. I continued to watch the street lamp. Time passed before I realized I had no idea where the creature went. It could be anywhere around us. My eyes drifted from the light to the trees, winding slowly along the shadowed details of the forest. I turned my head completely to the side and saw the last thing I wanted to see. a pair of eyes staring right back at me. It was a dozen feet away from the car. A small dark face staring at me. It looked like it had a snout, but its facial features were that of a human. I screamed. I wouldn't even lie about it. I shrieked as loud as I could and I pointed at it. I turned to Nick, who didn't seem fazed by my cowardliness. He squinted at it and shifted the car into reverse and back out of the woods and headed back towards the city. On the drive back, he explained to me that there were some kind of creatures that lived out on the north side of the city in the woods. I was in disbelief, but it was obviously true. I saw them. He told me that he had discovered them while driving around a long time ago and had observed them ever since. He asked if I would go out there with him from time to time and check on them with him. I agreed, not sure if I had a choice. The creatures really aren't even the story here. They are the least exciting thing that happened with Nick and I. Ghost, a demon, a cult in the forest, possessed homeless people, a slew of other stories all ready to be told. Just ask away. I see 2 people requesting the cult story. I can do this. Where I reside, there was a place called Purple Church. An old urban legend that there was a church in the same general area as those little scouted creatures that had been corrupted by its pastors back in the late 1980s, I believe. They started sacrificing people and did a complete 180, worshipping Jesus to Satan. The place was closed down and condemned, but people continued to practice the rituals and sacrifices out there. It got so bad and the crime rate was so high out there, killing animals, assault on people hiking in the woods, people disappearing, that the police went to the church during the day, roped it off, and were ordered to burn it to the ground. Well, being the X-File that I was, I did some research on the creepy places in the state I was in and found that. I told Nick about it, who nodded. I stated I wanted to go there, and he agreed, saying we should do so at night. During the day, it was boring. He had clearly been out there before. He didn't ask any questions about it. The sun set, and his old car pulled up to my house. I left the place with my switchblade, mace, phone, maglite, and a lighter. I wasn't fucking around. Everything I read said this place was dangerous. We drove out the same way to get the creatures, but followed the road past the lamp and the fence into the actual forest. There were several abandoned houses, and if my eyesight wasn't failing me, there were small piles of ruined vehicles out in the woods. When we got past the lamp, he turned the lights off his vehicle and parked it off the street behind some bushes. I asked him why, and he said it was too loud. It would get us caught. We proceeded on foot. Throughout the forest, I could hear the roaring of truck engines all throughout the woods. I thought little of it, expecting rednecks and drunk off-roaders. I was wrong. As I followed Nick down the path, he explained that people still come out here, even lived out here to worship the church. I laughed a little. He stopped and asked what was funny. I said nothing, like an embarrassed child, and walked on. We passed by a bathtub and it smelled terribly. I found it odd that there was a porcelain tub out in the middle of the woods, so I pointed the flashlight over at it and turned it on. Inside were dozens of dead animals, some fresh, some nothing but bones. I gagged and turned the light off, but it was too late. "Hey!" I heard someone scream from the forest, apparently giving away our position. I turned to run, tearing off down the trail and deeper into the woods. To this day, I don't know where Nick went. I turned around and saw no sign of him. I don't know if he ran the other direction, was on the other side of me, even in front of me. He was just gone. A truck with no headlights roared into view. Half a dozen people loaded into the back with a spotlight and weapons. I bolted into the thick of the woods and dove into a pile of brush and logs. It was a decent hiding spot, mainly because it couldn't be seen at all. It was almost like a beaver's den. Men came off the trail and began exploring the woods. They had machetes and hatchets from what it looked like. Thankfully, all the light they had was from a spotlight mounted on the back of the truck. The men came closer and closer, weaving through the trees and grass carefully. It wouldn't be long before they found me. Then I heard a crash. The spotlight shattered, the illumination it provided dying away and leaving the landscape in a blackness so deep I couldn't see anything. The men complained and asked for the light to be turned back on. There was no response from the men on the back of the truck. It grew completely silent as everyone realized what was happening. There was someone else out here. All of a sudden, a man screamed to my right. I turned to look, but I couldn't see anything. One by one, shrieks erupted around me, each man being attacked by something. The men were being tossed around like dolls, slammed into trees and beat into submission by a tall, thin figure. Before I could make an escape, a hand wrapped around my mouth from behind. I struggled for a moment, turning to find out it was Nick. He beckoned me on and I followed him back to his car. We trotted silently throughout the woods and left the same way we had come. I still don't know what happened out there. It could have been him that thrashed all those guys. But how he did it right behind me, it was so strange. I was terrified. We got to his car and headed home. He dropped me off without saying a word. Whenever we chilled, we would hang out at my house. My roommate had gotten a girlfriend, so the house became a fucking war zone, and we didn't like to chill there anymore. So I asked Nick if I could kick it at his place. He hesitated and finally said okay. It was a pretty dull place. 2-bedroom house, older building, pretty plain, nothing out of the ordinary. We had chilled there and watched movies and ate pizza a couple of nights in a row before a weird thing happened. We were sitting in his living room watching some movie on Netflix when, out of nowhere, his door to his bedroom, which is clearly visible from the couch, explodes open. It was closed and latched as far as I know, and out of nowhere it slams against the wall like someone kicked it open. I turned to look at him. He looked at the door for a split second, then went back to watching the movie. I asked him if that was normal and he said, yeah. I'd crashed over at his place that night. I slept on the couch, he slept in his room. The entire night I slept facing the couch. All I could hear from the time we went to bed until the sun rose was someone walking around his house, footsteps pattering from room to room, but Nick never left his room. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, something was walking around and had kicked his door open. Well, I asked about it, yeah. But the thing with Nick was that I never got an answer from him. Not a direct one. I asked who was walking around his house. He said he didn't know its name. And I was just like, what the fuck? What is it? He shrugged. That fucking shrug used to drive me nuts, but I got used to it. Another time we were outside smoking cigars in his backyard. I'd picked them up on a whim just because. So we were puffing on these things on his back porch, sitting in chairs and enjoying the night. Suddenly, the lights in his house go off. I turn to look. He doesn't even look. Nothing ever bothered him. He was never concerned for anything. I could hear the familiar footsteps padding around his house. I did my best to ignore it and continued to talk to Nick. He got up and walked out from the porch and out into the moonlight, stretching his legs. I guess. I took this opportunity to turn around and peek into the house. Inside, a few lights were on. The light from his fish tank, the light from a clock. It provided just enough light to allow me to see a figure walking around from room to room, a shadowy being darting from hallway to kitchen, and every room in between. I called out to Nick, who turned and asked me what was wrong. I pointed at the being. Nick approached me and looked inside. The being snapped around and faced us. I couldn't make out a single detail of its person. It stared at us for a moment before disappearing deeper into his house. Nick placed his cigar on the table and entered the house, asking me to remain outside, which I did. He followed it back into his room. I watched his window, which had the curtains drawn over it. Time passed and I simply sucked on my cigar, waiting for something to happen. There was finally a flash of light from his room. White light, not light from a bulb. After the flash, the lights in his house came back, and he exited his home and sat down beside me and continued smoking his stogie. Stuff like that would happen from time to time in his house. Once, I was in the shower at his place after I had crashed there. While showering, the lights went out in the bathroom. It was uncomfortable because I thought Nick was in there. I pulled the curtain back and reached for the light and flicked it on. The door was still locked. Other times, doors would be kicked open by nothing. Much like that first night, any night I slept there, I would hear the person walking around his home, or hear whispers or knocking. One night I showed up at his place on a Friday with some alcohol and the new Dead Space game. I brought my Xbox and all that and said we were staying up all weekend playing this game. He didn't want to, but finally gave in. I mixed some drinks, hooked up my 360 to his TV, and the fun began. An hour or so went by and we were both slamming back drinks. He was taking it hard. He changed. He wasn't as stoic, but he was weird. He had an accent, not a fake one, like a legitimate accent. and I had a little trouble understanding. Italian or French, I have no idea. His language varied, not always speaking English. And he was actually smiling and having fun. We got to that point in Dark Souls 2 that we could not beat and got bored and started talking and just generally dicking around. He took me into his room and showed me his knives. He had a knife under his pillow and one by his windowsill and another hidden inside a book. He showed me maps and leather-bound books and tomes of information, some written in weird languages, all written about weird things. Some how to hunt, others how to make traps, but not any kind of mammal I know about. He had a bear trap in his closet and a small compact shotgun tucked into the corner. A small pile of stakes, like a vampire slayer, were also piled in the closet, or should I call it an armory? It was stocked with weapons. I took these pictures at his place. I swear to God he was looking away from me. They were on my old phone when I took them. We were both sitting on his bed, facing the TV playing the Xbox in the photo. In the photo, he is clearly facing me. When I took it, he was facing to the left side of the picture. I am what the fucking right now. I don't know if he turned real fast or just knew I was taking the photo. Or if he could change them. I don't know what the fuck. I'll leave one photo up for reference, but won't post any more. I feel weird, like he knows I'm telling people all of this. Oh well, too late now, another story. I had gotten a call from him one day after work. Told me to meet him up at his place of work at about 11 p.m. I agreed and said I would be there. He worked just a few miles away from my house at a morgue or something. Dead bodies in and out of there. Funeral home? Maybe. He drove around and picked up dead bodies from the city, dressed them up, made them look presentable. He liked to talk about them from time to time. He enjoyed his work. I pulled up at the building at the designated time to find only his vehicle in the parking lot. I got out of my car, locked it, and approached the door. I yanked on the handle to find it was locked. Confused, I made a few laps around the building and even peeked inside Nick's car to find absolutely no sign of him. I called him a few times before I finally spotted him by the tree line, the small patch of forest that separated the building from the acute graveyard it had. He beckoned me over and I disappeared back into the trees. I made my way over to the trees and wandered through the brush until I stood in the cemetery. Again, Nick was gone. I couldn't see him anywhere. I wandered between the headstones for a while before seeing an open grave. The hole was dug, but there was no casket or body within. Ready for a burial the following day, I had assumed. I meandered over to it and peered inside to find Nick. He was laying on his back, hands placed to his head, relaxing. He stared up at the stars and the moon. He glanced at me briefly and looked back to the sky. I plopped down on the side of the grave and let my legs hang freely, careful not to knock any dirt loose onto Nick. We spoke briefly of the day, how work was and what we had for lunch, small talk mostly. "Do you trust me?" he asked. I arched an eyebrow at him and nodded. He asked nothing more of it, remaining silent. I asked him the same question, honestly curious of the answer. "I do." With that, he hopped up and pulled himself out of the grave. After dusting himself off, he led me into his place of work, the door opening easily to his touch. No key, no button. It simply pulled right open, even though it had been locked not 20 minutes before. We entered the funeral home and passed through a small welcoming lobby. At a few chairs, the main counter, and a vase with flowers placed on a sturdy wooden table. He led me through the main hall back into the dressing room. Inside was a wall of drawers. Each drawer used to store and keep bodies cool. I wasn't comfortable at all, but he wanted me to see something. Apparently, he showed me the tables where they operated and made people look presentable. Sewing equipment, makeup, everything. He had shelf after shelf of tools and objects he used for work, scalpels, scissors, needles, thread, eyeliner, and more. Racks of clothing were found across the tables, dresses to suits, and everywhere in between. And there was a tall door. Sorry guys, worked a 14-hour shift at work and needed to sleep. I'm back for a short while. As for the questions and comments below, I never saw him with anyone else. Even when I would stop by his work in the middle of the day, in the middle of the work week, the whole place was entirely empty. Never saw another car there. I entertained the thought that he owned the place and was the only one that worked there. Or maybe the place isn't even there at all, and I am the only one who can see it. As for him, I typed that. You might be right. He actually gave me a call yesterday. Had no real topic brought up, just asked a few questions, direct ones. Where have you been? Can I still trust you? And stuff like that. All went well, didn't feel threatened. As for the light post creatures, we saw them several times. I don't know if he looked after them or he hunted them or what. I was never there for any kind of confrontations. We would just drive out there and observe them. Few times they approached the car, even touched the windows. This one night, Nick and I had driven downtown into this old urban decayed brick and mortar side of the city, pretty much abandoned, pretty late, and didn't see anyone else around. He said he'd like to come to this side of the city to just wander around. He did that for about an hour. All the while, he interviewed on my beliefs on aliens/religion. We turned a corner around this old building and saw a raggedy man standing there about 20 feet down the sidewalk from us. Totally still, just standing there. We both stopped and watched the guy for a moment. We shared a look before Nick stepped forward and started approaching. I wasn't frightened. I mean, Nick may be taller, but I lift, 6 foot, 220. I'd been going to a boxing gym for about a year at the time. Still, something was just creepy about the whole situation. The man was clearly homeless, and somehow aware we were going to be coming around that corner. Nick took a second step forward before the man started fucking howling. I mean shrieking. His mouth opened and he let loose a blast of air. It was mind-numbing. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears. A moment passed before the screaming stopped. I dropped my hands back to my sides and opened my eyes. The homeless man was now standing toe-to-toe with me, literally not an inch from my nose. I yelped, stepping back. How the hell did he get from that far away to be touching me that close in a matter of seconds without me hearing him? I took another step back. The man smelled awful, like charred flesh and death. His eyes were white and his breath smelled like roadkill. I looked around for Nick and he was nowhere to be found. The man grunted and continued to make animal-like noises. I was walking backwards at a steady pace now. I got a few more feet away before I bumped into something. Relief flooded through, assuming it was Nick. I turned to find a second, grungy, rough-looking man with the same white eyes and a smell of death. Air caught in my throat as I quickly checked my surroundings, seeing a dozen of these bums coming out of the alleys, climbing fences, all approaching me. I was done playing. I grabbed the closest guy and went to push him to the ground. He was incredibly strong and completely overpowered me. He grabbed me by both arms and slammed me into the wall, knocking the wind and wits out of my body. I slumped to the floor and pressed my eyes closed. My head rang from the impact of the brick wall and the lack of air in my lungs. I could hear the steady sound of approaching footsteps. Realizing I was probably surrounded, I looked up but continued to squint. My head was in too much pain to be able to see correctly. Before I could ask for them to stop, there was a flash of light, similar to the flash of light that came from Nick's window that one night. The homeless men howled in disgust. I could hear a scuffle begin, some kind of struggle. The pound of bone to skin, and the slump of bodies to the floor, or into the wall. Several minutes went by with flashes of light and strikes being thrown into someone's body. Finally, I felt a pair of strong, slender hands pick me up. I'm not sure if I was slung over someone's shoulders, or cradled like a baby. I may have been dragged. I am not sure. I just remember being sat in the leather seat of Nick's old car, and the familiar tunes of his cassette player. I woke up the following morning in my bed with some bruises. The demon started at St. Vincent's. We had gone there for some urban exploring. Heard it was haunted. He said he had never been down there and seemed excited actually. We drove by it a few times to scout it out. It was an old ransacked building right off the main road. We didn't see any security or homeless people, so we waited for traffic to slow down and we made our move. We parked across the street and hightailed it from one side to the other. We made a few loops around the building, double checking to make sure if it was truly empty. We entered it and wandered around the 2-level building. It was totally destroyed, being defaced and torn apart beyond all recognition. We picked through some of the rubble before it got dark and found nothing. The sun set and we left to avoid garnering attention, and vowed to return after a work week. St. Vincent's is my favorite. Like I said, we went back out there after about a week and did some exploring. We sifted through the top floor from corner to corner. There was a ton of stuff up there. In one room, there was a desk with a bunch of old candles melted onto it. In this office, I discovered a fireproof safe. Those old little lock boxes, tan in color. It was behind a filing cabinet under some rubble. We tried to jimmy it open, but the tumblers wouldn't give to my untrained hands. Nick messed with it for a while and had the same results. We placed it where we found it, realizing it could be a drug deal or something serious. Suddenly uncomfortable, we headed downstairs to continue our expedition. On the ground floor, the place was thrashed, like a tornado had swept through. Chunks of the walls were missing, graffiti and trash in one room, though there was a single yellow balloon tied to a chair. The balloon was new, still floating with fresh helium. It was creepy, but we ignored it. In retrospect, that was pretty dumb of us. Someone had obviously been down there to tie the balloon to the chair. We raked through the debris, searching for anything of interest. That's when we heard it. Footsteps treaded softly above us. Someone was on the second floor. They were light-footed, making the softest sound. I turned to Nick, who was staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps stopped and I inhaled. The thought of someone up there had totally petrified me. Something crashed to the floor, a board or a box maybe. The footsteps grew heavy and aggressive, now stomping and knocking things over. Nick and I immediately retreated into a smaller room and hid behind a desk. Twilight had set in, and darkness was not consuming the building. The steps pounded violently down the stairs. The being walked heavily through the ground floor, rarely stopping for any length of time. I was wide-eyed, staring at Nick for an answer. All he did was shrug. Finally, we heard the creature step into the room we were in. It stood motionless, heavy breathing coming from it. The room began to smell like charred flesh and vomit. It was hard not to gag, but I prevailed, stifling my hacking cough. The creature actually spoke.
There's no need to hide. Santos never returned here.
It spoke deep and grumbling, like its throat was swollen and its lungs were filled with fluid. It then exited the room and the building. We waited a few minutes before coming from behind the desk. Nick stood first and hopped over the old wooden piece of furniture. I did the same, planting a hand on top of the cold, splintering wood, swinging my legs over the other side. All Nick would say is that we need to leave, and so we did. We didn't go back upstairs, instead exiting through a broken window and sprinting across the courtyard and street until we reached his car. He thrust the key into his ignition and gave it a turn, the old engine roaring to life. On the drive home, I asked him what it was and where it came from. He shrugged, but I shook my head. The shrug wasn't going to work this time, so I continued to pry for answers. Finally, he gave in. I'm not sure what it was. Far too dark for a ghost. Ghosts don't speak like that. It was a demon if I had to guess. Something bound to that building. The place is evil. I could taste the malice there. I then asked who Santos was. He explained that was his last name, that the demon knew who he was, which wasn't good. So I shook my head. Nick continued to tell me that we needed to find the key to the lockbox. He wanted to see its contents. I agreed to help him find the key on one condition, that he included me in the adventures. I wanted to know more about what was going on and not kept in the dark. He reluctantly agreed and he dropped me off. Nick pulled his sleeves up, exposing his arms. I had never seen him without a long-sleeved shirt and was surprised to see his skin was covered in script tattoos. He said goodnight and I went to bed. Nick and I took our sweet time returning to St. Vincent's. A couple work weeks passed. We both worked Monday through Friday typically, and caught a dinner, a couple of movies, and generally chilled out. The encounter with the demon at the abandoned building was a little startling, mainly for me, but even Nick seemed put off by it. Finally, he made the statement. He wanted to go back. He made the call early on a Saturday and said we should depart later in the evening. I agreed and told him I would be ready. The day passed quickly, for I was pretty excited and nervous to return to St. Vincent's. Finally, the sun began to set and I heard a similar roar of Nick's car in the driveway of my house. It was a quick trip over to the old brick building. We parked across the street again and slipped over the asphalt and into the depths of St. Vincent's. We made short work of the upper level, scoping out the few corners we hadn't checked out on the trip prior. We pulled the lockbox out of the rubble and placed it onto the wax-covered table nearby. After securing the lockbox and searching the top floor, we descended to the first level and slowly began combing through the trash and debris. We stayed silent in the darkness, using small LED lights to illuminate our way. I think the reason we stayed quiet was the fear of stirring the demon up again. At least, that was my reason. An hour passed and we still had no results. It was disheartening. Realizing we're literally looking for a needle in a haystack. Maybe the owner took the key and forgot the box, I offered, sheepishly. Nick shook his head with complete confidence. He was convinced the key was here. Why would someone take the key but not the valuables? He questioned. I agreed and continued the search. I found info on St. Vincent's and the murders. Can't link you using my phone. St. Vincent's Home for Boys, Oklahoma. We continued the search well into the night before finally we caught onto something. I'd tried to open one of the drawers on the desk on the bottom floor, the same desk we had hid behind when the demon came. It held fast against my touch, not pulling open to reveal its contents to me. I made a note of this and told Nick, who quickly began working the drawer open. First, we tried to brute force, yanking, kicking, and just beating the desk. Nothing worked. Nick reached into his pocket and produced a blade. Nothing fancy, a straight blade maybe 6 or 7 inches with a thin leather sheath. He bent down and began to pry the drawer open, away from the desk, deciding to just break it open. A few minutes passed before finally I heard a click and the drawer popped onto the ground. Inside there were several folded papers, a schedule from the 1980s, and listed times and places were in a certain order. Even a grocery list was among the papers, but at the bottom we saw the faint glisten of an old key. It was a simple key, much simpler than I thought it would be. We cheered in joy, literally, or at least I did. Nick didn't seem surprised to find the key. I, on the other hand, was completely ecstatic. We took hold of the key and ascended to the concrete stairs to the second floor. Nick led us straight to the box and slid the key into the lock. A simple twist of his hand moved the tumblers and brought the box right open. Inside were more papers, and several very yellowed old folders. We already knew about the murders and happenings of St. Vincent when it was open and used in the year before. These papers elaborated on the killings, the people involved, and all incidents leading up to the deaths of the employees, patients, and the very owner and operator of the Home for Boys. There were files on each of the people involved in the murders, written conversations, journal notes, and even predictions. Whoever owned the lockbox was aware of the incidents that happened in St. Vincent's Home for the Boys and did nothing about them. The notes described a tangible presence that was turning things for the worst. This being had made itself known over the years, but had affected one employee particularly, a male nurse. He spoke and babbled of it regularly. Have you ever wondered there would be consequences for your actions, OP? Demons coming after you, and certain death, or satanic cults? Well, the encounters with the demons grew worse and worse, like uncovering the additional information about the murders of St. Vincent. He showed me how to track spirits, how to sense them. Seeing them took years. What kind of beasts reside where, how to handle them, which are hostile. He taught me survival stuff, like stuff you would find in a scout's handbook, how to build traps and stuff, track things. He taught me eskrima, which is a form of Filipino knife fighting. He tried to teach me energy use, but I have no skill with it at all. He said it would take time, but I have little patience for it. Every day, death is actually what brought me here. Nick and I had an encounter where we saw our deaths. I have reason to believe mine would be coming soon, so I decided to come out and explain as much as I could without going against the order. Not really an order, but whatever it's called. More questions? Why do you think you'll die soon? What is the order? The oracle provided us with a vision. Well, long story short, my vision had a bit of dialogue in it. I heard that bit of dialogue recently, meaning my death could possibly happen soon. The order is just what I call it. I don't think it really has a name. It's just a collection of people like Nick spread out across the globe. Watcher, protectors, people who keep the paranormal in line, and soon to be extinct creatures in secret. There are so few that they mostly know each other by name. Some take on apprentices, train new people for new areas, or if they think they need help. The group has been in action for a long time, since the Crusades from what I understand. Nick has been a member for what seems like decades. He makes it seem like he is very old. Can you tell us more of your disturbing incidents with Nick? Like something that really left you distraught after it happened? Something that really messed me up? They all have heavy effects on me, to be honest. Once we were tracking these things through the forest, way southeast of the city, out by a lake. Pets had been disappearing. We found a pile of dead dogs and cats, torn apart and snacked on by something. Something with hands. That had me pretty twisted, seeing all these dogs that had owners waiting for them at home. There was this time Nick had called me up in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. I'd been sleeping and had work in a few hours, but Nick insisted I go with him. He claimed he had a dream and it needed to be investigated. We went downtown to this old part of the brick city, abandoned near where the bums attacked us. We went to one of the big buildings, a boarded up abandoned theater, like Broadway theatrical play theater, balconies and a large stage and whatnot. There was a vampire living inside that was feasting on the homeless. The place smelled like blood. It was terrifying because it was talking to us. What did your conversation consist of? You'll have to forgive me being a little skeptical on this, though. It talked to me mostly, asked me questions, mostly about why I had come to that state, what food I liked, what my hobbies consisted of, if I missed my family. Asked if I believed in God or religion. Mostly just curious about things. It crawled along the darkness of the roof and through the rafters, scurrying along the stage floor all throughout the darkness, never staying still for too long. Very pale, long dark hair that was greasy and very thin. Nick ignored it, searching throughout the theater for hidden people, bodies, trying to catch the being and other things. They talked briefly. It didn't seem interested in Nick. They had probably met before. He could have just been doing a checkup on it. Its name was Lucas, however it's spelled. Sounded very French or German, not very good with accents / nationality. So, OP, you said you moved back to the West Coast. Are you acting as a watcher over that area now? If so, what are the creatures, etc. that you check in on? Could you give us a list? Also, what is the purpose of those checkups? Yeah, making sure that they are staying populated. No issues with them being extinct. Making sure they stay fed, not having any issues with wildlife. Making sure they stay out of human territory and hidden in the wild. Creatures over here consist of a Bigfoot-type creature that lives on Mogollon Rim. They are like sloths that live out in the mountains / forest and canyons up north, very tall, muscular, and furry. Extremely long arms with massive talons on the end. For reference, try looking up Mogollon Monster. There was some newspaper sightings back in the day. There's this one spider in Sedona, only one. It is massive, bigger than a car. That is the biggest chore of this state, keeping it away from the mountain faces and towns. A breed of goblin or something similar lives in the deserts out here. Long-eared, green-gray skin, sharp teeth, live north of the Grand Canyon and south by Tombstone, out in the middle of nowhere in holes in the ground. They can communicate, very easy to deal with. As long as we provide them with monthly food / luxuries, they agree to stay underground most of the day. Big snakes, big lizards, typical vamps residing in old buildings and caves, were-beings, demon ghouls, hybrids, possessed folk.